The sun blazed high above the alien arena, its golden light spilling over the ring of stone pillars. The ground shimmered with heat, and the air smelled faintly of iron. Hundreds of purple-skinned warriors stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the two figures in the center. One was a towering alien male with muscles like chiseled rock. The other, a human soldier in green combat trousers, breathing heavily but standing tall. Around them, the crowd waited for the outcome, knowing the duel was more than just a fight. It was a matter of honor. The human's fists were bruised and his ribs ached from repeated blows, but he refused to fall. His opponent roared and charged again, striking with a force that could break stone. Yet the human moved with quick precision, ducking under the alien swing and driving his elbow hard into the ribs. A gasp spread through the audience as the alien stumbled backward. The soldier saw his chance and attacked with relentless speed, his fists a blur. Within moments, the massive alien crashed to the ground, unconscious. The arena erupted in shouts, half in disbelief, half in rage. From the front row, a young alien woman rose to her knees, her eyes wide and fixed on the victor. Her skin was a deep, flawless violet, her braids falling over her shoulders. She was the mate of the fallen warrior, bound to him by custom and tradition. But here, their laws were clear. If her mate was defeated in open combat, she would belong to the victor. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to happen. The human, still catching his breath, had no idea of the law that would now bind her fate to his. Two elders stepped forward, their robes flowing like shadows. They raised their staffs and announced the verdict in booming voices. The human had won, and by the ancient code of the Torvan people, the defeated warrior's mate was now his concubine. Murmurs swept the crowd, some faces showing outrage, others dark curiosity. The human's brows furrowed as the words sank in. He had fought to survive, not to claim ownership of another being. But the law here was not his own, and the people's eyes were on him. The alien woman approached, each step slow and deliberate. Her gaze did not waver from his face, though her heart pounded in her chest. She knelt before him, bowing her head in a gesture that was both submission and defiance. Her voice was soft but steady as she spoke in her native tongue, a language the human could not understand. Yet in her tone, he heard both resentment and resolve. He glanced at the elders, searching for an explanation, but only received nods, affirming the binding nature of the tradition. Around them, the warriors began to disperse, though some lingered to watch what would happen next. A few glared at the human with thinly veiled hatred, while others whispered among themselves, perhaps wondering if he would survive the consequences of his victory. The defeated male was being carried away, still unconscious, his pride shattered. The air was heavy with unspoken tension. The human understood he had stepped into a web of politics, culture, and ancient customs far more dangerous than the fight. He had just won. The woman's eyes flicked briefly toward the horizon where the twin moons would soon rise. She knew the elders would expect her to fulfill the role tradition demanded, yet something deep inside her refused to be only a prize. If she must follow the law, she would do it on her own terms. She met the human's gaze again, her expression unreadable. In that brief moment, something passed between them, not acceptance, not rebellion, but an unspoken challenge. He extended his hand to her, unsure why. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was the faint understanding that she was more than just a part of his victory. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. The heat of her skin surprised him, as did the strength of her grip. Around them, the whispers grew louder, but neither of them looked away. Whatever came next would not be simple, and neither of them could yet see the path ahead. The human followed the elders out of the arena, his boots crunching over the sandy ground. The heat pressed down on him, but his mind was on the alien woman. Walking a few paces behind, she moved with a controlled grace, her eyes scanning their surroundings without revealing her thoughts. Warriors stepped aside to let them pass, some with cold stares, others with mocking smirks. Every gaze seemed to weigh on him, measuring if he deserved the prize their law had given him. They reached a stone corridor carved into the side of a cliff. Torches burned along the walls, their flames steady despite the dry wind. The elders led him into a wide chamber, its walls etched with symbols older than the city itself. At the center was a circular platform surrounded by shallow pools of water. The woman stepped forward and stood at the edge, her reflection shimmering beneath her. An elder began to speak in their guttural language, his voice carrying the weight of judgment and tradition. The human understood only a few words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a ritual. The woman's gaze shifted to him as the elder's voice grew louder. She wore no expression of fear or submission, only calm defiance. He realized that whatever this ritual was, it bound her to him in the eyes of her people. He had not asked for this, yet walking away would likely mean dishonor or worse. The thought of rejecting their law crossed his mind, but he remembered the warriors' stares in the arena. Refusal could mark him as a coward or even a criminal. He met her eyes, and in them he saw the same silent calculation. The elder motioned for them to step onto the platform. She went first, her bare feet leaving faint ripples in the water. He followed, feeling the stone cool beneath his boots. The elder raised his staff, and the other figures in the room began to chant. Their voices blended with the soft echo of dripping water, creating a rhythm that seemed to slow the air itself. A second elder approached carrying a silver vessel. He poured a thin stream of glowing liquid into the pool, turning the water a pale gold. The woman reached down and touched the surface with her fingertips. The glow spread across the water, curling around her hands like living light. She spoke words he could not understand, her voice soft but steady. Then she gestured toward him, urging him to do the same. He knelt, feeling the cool water soak into his hands. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the light flared and a warmth spread through his palms. Gasps echoed through the chamber, though whether in approval or disapproval, he could not tell. The woman's expression did not change, but her eyes lingered on his hands for just a heartbeat longer than before. The ritual ended with the elders lowering their staffs. The chanting faded, leaving only the faint sound of the water settling. One elder stepped forward and declared something in their tongue. The human caught one word he now knew too well: concubine. The declaration was final. The woman was now bound to him by their code, and the city would see them as one unit. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, a mixture of judgment, curiosity, and expectation. The woman turned away first, her braids swaying as she stepped off the platform. Outside, the air was cooler, touched by the approaching night. The twin moons had begun to rise, casting pale light over the stone streets. She walked ahead of him without a word, her posture upright and unyielding. Guards lined the path, their weapons resting in their hands, their eyes tracking his every move. He wondered if they were here to protect him or to watch him. The thought brought an uneasy knock to his stomach. The woman never looked back, but somehow he knew she was aware of his every step. They reached a tall building of carved stone and stepped inside. The interior was lit by hanging lanterns that gave off a warm glow. She stopped in the middle of the hall and finally turned to face him. Her voice was low but clear as she spoke in her language, each word deliberate. He could not understand the meaning, but the tone carried both warning and promise. She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his, and for the first time he sensed that whatever bound them now was not just the result of a battle, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The room they entered was larger than he expected, its high ceiling supported by massive stone beams carved with strange symbols. The walls were lined with shelves holding objects he could not name, each one glinting in the lantern light. A low table sat in the center, surrounded by cushions. The woman crossed the room without speaking, her steps silent on the smooth floor. She placed a hand on one of the carved beams as if drawing strength from it, then turned toward him with a look that made it clear she was not about to act as a meek servant. He removed his gear and set it on the table, his eyes never leaving her. She was watching him as well, her golden irises reflecting the warm light. The tension between them was sharp, unbroken by words. He thought of asking her name, but something about the moment told him she would not give it freely. The law might have given her to him, but respect would have to be earned. She stepped closer, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like he was the one being claimed. A faint sound from outside drew his attention. Footsteps approached the building, heavy and deliberate. She noticed too, her gaze shifting toward the door. The wood creaked as it opened, revealing two armored warriors. They entered without asking permission, their faces set in grim expressions. One of them spoke quickly in their language, his eyes locked on the human. The woman responded sharply, her tone edged with warning. Whatever she said made the warriors pause, but not step back. The air between them was heavy with unspoken threats. Taller of the two warriors stepped forward, pointing at the human's chest. His words were harsh and clipped, and though the meaning was unclear, the intent was obvious. This was a challenge, not unlike the one in the arena. The woman's jaw tightened. She spoke again, her voice low but fierce, and for a moment, the warrior's expression faltered. But then he straightened, pulling a curved blade from his belt and holding it in plain view. The message was clear: honor had not been satisfied. The human glanced at the woman, searching for guidance. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes told him enough. This was another test, one he could not refuse. Slowly, he stepped forward, his own hands empty but his stance ready. The warriors circled him, testing his movements, looking for weakness. The human stayed light on his feet, remembering the rhythm of the last fight. When the warrior lunged, he sidestepped and struck the man's wrist, sending the blade clattering to the floor. The room erupted in shouts from the guards outside. The disarmed warrior glared at him, breathing hard. The human expected another attack, but instead the man stepped back, his head lowering slightly. It was not submission, but acknowledgement. The woman moved to stand between them, saying something to the warrior in a softer tone. The man nodded once before turning and leaving with his companion. The door shut behind them, leaving the room in silence again. The human turned to her, unsure if what had just happened was a warning, a test, or both. She crossed her arms and studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke in a measured voice, her words slow and deliberate, as though trying to bridge the gap between their languages. He caught fragments: battle, law, honor, but the rest was lost on him. Still, he understood the meaning in her eyes. She was telling him that survival here would take more than strength. It would take understanding, patience, and the ability to navigate their world without losing himself. And she was telling him this for a reason. The night deepened outside, the lanterns casting long shadows across the floor. Somewhere in the city, drums began to beat in a slow, steady rhythm. She walked to the window and looked out, her silhouette framed by the pale light of the moons. He watched her, wondering if she saw herself as captive or protector. Perhaps she was both. When she turned back to face him, there was something new in her gaze, not trust, but the beginning of a choice she had yet to make. Asterisk. The morning light crept through the high windows, casting long beams across the stone floor. The human woke to the distant sound of horns echoing through the city. The woman was already awake, standing near the doorway with her hands clasped behind her back. Her posture was straight and her expression calm, but her eyes shifted toward him as soon as he stirred. She motioned for him to follow, and without a word, she led him outside into the cool air of dawn. The streets were less crowded than the night before, but every face they passed turned to look. Some eyes held curiosity, others open hostility. Guards stationed at the corners watched closely as the two walked side by side. The woman's pace was steady, and he kept stride with her, noting the way she seemed to know every turn without hesitation. They passed towering statues of warriors from ages past, their faces carved in unyielding stone. Each one held a weapon. High, as if still guarding the city, even in death, they arrived at a wide plaza where a raised platform stood at the center. Around it, a small crowd was already gathering. The woman guided him to the edge where two elders waited. One elder, tall and broad-shouldered despite his age, greeted the woman in their language. The conversation was brief but intense, their voices low and controlled. The elder's gaze shifted to the human, and for a moment, the man felt the weight of judgment. Whatever was about to happen, it would not be for the crowd's entertainment alone. The elder stepped onto the platform and raised his arms. His voice carried across the plaza, speaking in long rolling phrases. The human could not understand the words, but the rhythm and tone reminded him of a declaration. The crowd listened in silence, every eye on the platform. The woman stepped forward when the elder called her name, her chin high and her stance unshaken. She stood beside the human, their shoulders nearly touching, yet there was no sign of submission in her movements. The elder drew a curved blade from a sheath and held it between them. He spoke a single word, sharp and final. She took the blade without hesitation and turned to face the human. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she stepped closer and extended the weapon toward him, handle first. He took it, feeling the weight of the metal in his hand. Her eyes locked on his, and though no words passed between them, he understood. This was not a threat, it was a test of trust. He flipped the blade in his hand, holding it by the flat of the steel, and returned it to her. A murmur spread through the crowd. The elder nodded once, as though approving of his choice. She sheathed the weapon and stepped back, but the faintest trace of something respect, perhaps, had softened her gaze. The elder spoke again, and the crowd began to disperse, though more than a few lingered to watch the two of them walk away from the platform. They left the plaza and entered a narrow street lined with market stalls. The sense of strange spices and cooked meat filled the air, mingling with the sound of traders calling out their goods. The woman stopped at a stall selling dried fruits and spoke briefly to the merchant. The man handed her a small bundle wrapped in cloth, which she passed to the human. He unwrapped it to find a selection of deep red and gold fruits, their surfaces smooth and cool. She gestured for him to eat, her expression unreadable. They returned to the stone building as the sun climbed higher. Inside, the woman set the bundle on the table and moved to the far side of the room. She spoke without looking at him, her words flowing in the measured pace of her language. He caught only fragments, but he recognized a warning in her tone. Whatever trials had passed so far were not the end. Outside these walls, forces were moving against them, and sooner or later, the choice between survival and honor would have to be made. The midday heat pressed against the walls of the stone building, making the air inside heavy. The human sat at the table, the bundle of fruits untouched before him. Across the room, the woman paced slowly, her hands clasped behind her back. Her eyes moved between the door and the narrow window, as though she was listening for something beyond the sound of the city. Finally, she stopped and looked at him directly, her voice low but firm as she spoke a single phrase in her language. Could not understand the words, but the tone told him it was important. She moved to the table, unwrapped one of the fruits, and cut it with a thin blade. She handed him half and ate the other herself, watching to make sure he did the same. The flesh was sweet and cool, a relief against the heat. When he finished, she gathered the remains and tossed them into a small clay bowl, then walked toward the door. With a tilt of her head, she signaled for him to follow. They stepped out into the sunlit streets, the brightness forcing his eyes to narrow. The market had grown busier since morning, with traders shouting their offers and buyers crowding around stalls. Children darted between the legs of taller figures, their laughter mixing with the calls of merchants. The woman led him past the noise and into a quieter alley, where the shade provided a welcome break from the heat. There, she stopped and turned to face him, her expression sharper than before. From the mouth of the alley, a group of 3 warriors appeared. Their armor was lighter than those he had seen in the arena, but their movements were purposeful. One of them called out to the woman, his tone carrying the edge of mockery. She replied without hesitation, her voice cold enough to cut the air. The warrior laughed and stepped closer, his eyes shifting to the human. The challenge was clear, though. No weapon had yet been drawn. The human felt his muscles tense as the space between them shrank. The first warrior moved in fast, but the human sidestepped and struck his shoulder, forcing him back. Another came from the side, swinging low, but the human caught his arm and twisted, sending him stumbling. The third hesitated, then lunged forward with a quick strike aimed at the human's ribs. He blocked with his forearm, feeling the impact ripple through his bones. The fight was short, the warriors retreating when they realized they could not overpower him quickly. The woman stood still, watching every move with narrowed eyes. When the last of them disappeared into the crowd, she stepped closer. Her tone shifted, less sharp now, but still measured. She placed her hand on his shoulder, the gesture lasting only a moment before she pulled away. He understood it for what it was, a sign that he had met another test without failing. Yet there was no relief in her gaze. Instead, there was something heavier, a recognition that these challenges were not ending, only changing form. They made their way back to the main streets, the woman walking slightly ahead this time. The crowd parted for them more than before, some faces showing respect, others thinly veiled resentment. They passed under an archway carved with intricate designs, the stone cool to the touch. Beyond it lay a courtyard filled with fountains and shaded walkways. She slowed her pace here, allowing him to take in the space, but her eyes were constantly scanning, never still for long. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they returned to the building. Inside, the air was cooler, the lanterns already lit. She closed the door behind them and leaned against it, her gaze fixed on him for a long moment. Then she spoke again, this time with a note of finality in her voice. Though the words were foreign, the meaning was clear. Something was coming, and when it arrived, neither the law nor the customs of her people would be enough to decide their fate. The night settled over the city with a heavy stillness. From the narrow window, the human could see the glow of lanterns flickering in the streets below. The air was cooler now, but it carried a tension that felt sharper than the day's heat. The woman stood near the table, her hands resting lightly on its edge. She seemed lost in thought until the distant sound of a horn broke the silence. Her head lifted sharply, and without a word, she moved toward the door. He followed her into the dimly lit streets, where shadows stretched long across the stone. Few people were outside, and those who were moved quickly with their eyes downcast. The horn sounded again, this time closer, and he could see figures gathering in the central square. The woman led him there with quick, determined steps. The square was ringed with armed guards, their armor catching the lantern light. At the center stood an elder, flanked by warriors bearing tall banners that swayed in the night breeze. The elder began to speak in a voice that carried across the square. Though the human could not understand the words, he could read the mood in the faces around him. This was an announcement, and it was not one of peace. The woman listened without looking away from the elder, her expression hardening with each sentence. When the speech ended, a wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. The guards moved to block the exits, and the elder gestured for several people, including the human and the woman, to step forward. They were led to a smaller courtyard behind the square. Torches burned in high brackets, casting sharp light over The gathered group. The elder addressed them again, and this time, one of the warriors translated into broken human speech. An attack was coming from a rival clan beyond the mountains. The defenders would be chosen from those present. Refusal was not an option. The human's name was called, and then the woman's. She met his eyes briefly, and in that single glance, he saw both challenge and something like reluctant solidarity. Weapons were brought out, spears, blades, and shields marked with the crest of the city. The human chose a short sword with a solid weight, testing the balance in his hand. The woman selected a curved spear, the metal of its blade gleaming in the torchlight. Without ceremony, they were dismissed to prepare. The walk back to their building was silent, but it was not the silence of strangers. It was the quiet before a storm, heavy with what neither of them would say aloud. Inside, she placed her spear against the wall and began fastening pieces of light armor over her clothing. He strapped a leather guard to his forearm and adjusted the sword at his hip. She glanced at him once, as though measuring his readiness, and then turned away. The tension in the room was tight, but there was no fear in it. There was only the shared knowledge that by dawn, they would stand side by side in battle. That thought, more than any law or custom, was binding them together. She finished her preparations first and walked to the window. From there, she could see the line of the mountains faintly outlined against the starry sky. The enemy would come from there, and when they did, the city would be ready or it would fall. She stayed there for a while, silent, before finally turning to face him. In the dim light, her eyes caught the reflection of the lantern, bright and steady. She spoke a short sentence in her language, her voice low but certain. He did not understand the words, but he understood her meaning. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. And in that moment, he realized something had shifted. She was no longer just a woman given to him by the law of her people. She was a fighter, an ally, and perhaps even something more. Outside, the horn sounded a third time, and the city began to stir with the restless movements of those preparing for war. The first light of dawn revealed the city in motion. Warriors moved through the streets in tight formations, their armor catching the pale glow of the rising sun. The sound of boots striking stone blended with the low hum of voices giving orders. The human stood at the entrance of the building, the weight of his sword steady in his grip. The woman approached, her spear resting against her shoulder, her eyes scanning the horizon beyond the walls where the mountains loomed in shadow. They joined a larger group at the eastern gate, where banners swayed in the cool morning air. The gate itself was massive, built of thick stone and reinforced with iron. Beyond it stretched a narrow pass, the path leading straight toward the enemy territory. The air smelled faintly of dust and metal, a reminder of the battle to come. The woman stood beside him without speaking, her presence as steady as the wall behind them. The elder from the night before arrived and gave a sharp command, and the gates began to open. The group moved forward in measured steps, the sound of their march echoing off the high stone walls. The pass was silent except for the wind carrying the distant cry of birds. The human kept his eyes on the path ahead, but he could feel the tension in the ranks around him. Every warrior here knew that once they reached the valley beyond there would be no turning back. The woman's grip on her spear tightened as the narrow path began to widen, revealing the open land beyond. The enemy was already there, a line of figures waiting at the far end of the valley. Their armor was darker, their weapons jagged and unfamiliar. The two forces stopped within sight of each other, the gap between them charged with unspoken challenge. A single rider from the enemy side broke away and approached, his black cloak snapping in the wind. He shouted something in a deep voice, and though the words were not understood by the human, the meaning was clear. It was a demand for surrender. The elder stepped forward and answered with a voice that carried across the valley. His words were steady, but his stance was unyielding. The rider listened, then turned sharply and returned to his line. The moment he rejoined them, the enemy advanced, their weapons raised. The clash came fast. The human sword met the first strike with a sharp ring of steel. Beside him, the woman moved with precision, her spear sweeping in controlled arcs that kept the enemy at bay. The battle surged around them, the air filled with the sound of metal striking metal and the shouts of warriors. The human fought with quick, decisive movements, using speed to counter the strength of his opponents. At one point, an enemy soldier broke through the line and aimed for the woman's back. The human stepped in, deflecting the attack with a hard strike that sent the enemy stumbling. She turned her head briefly, meeting his eyes before returning to the fight without a word. The tide of the battle shifted as the defenders began to push the enemy back toward the pass. The woman drove her spear into the ground between them, creating a brief pause in the attack. The human saw her raise a hand in a signal, and within moments, a coordinated strike from their side forced the enemy to retreat further. The air was thick with dust now, the ground marked with deep lines from the clash of feet and weapons. Still, neither of them slowed their pace. By the time the enemy began to withdraw fully, the sun had climbed high above the valley. The human and the woman stood side by side, their weapons lowered, but their senses alert in case of a counterattack. Around them, the defenders regrouped, their voices mixing with the sound of the enemy retreating through the pass. She turned to him then, her breathing steady despite the fight, and for the first time since they had met, there was no barrier in her gaze, only the silent acknowledgement of what they had just survived together. The valley was quiet now, the enemy forces gone beyond the pass. The defenders moved slowly among the wounded, carrying those who could not walk and gathering weapons left behind. The human stood with his sword resting at his side, the weight of the fight still in his arms. The woman was a short distance away, speaking with one of the elders. Her spear was planted firmly in the ground beside her, and her voice carried the tone of a warrior who had earned her place. When she returned to him, there was no hesitation in her steps. She stopped close enough for him to see the dust streaking her face and the faint mark on her cheek where an enemy strike had nearly landed. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out and touched his forearm, not as a gesture of possession, but as one of recognition. In that single movement, she acknowledged him not as someone who had claimed her, but as someone who had stood beside her when it mattered most. They walked back toward the city together, their pace unhurried. The path was littered with signs of the battle-broken spears, dropped shields, and deep footprints pressed into the dirt. The sun was lowering now, casting long shadows over the mountains. Behind them, the elders and warriors began the slow work of sealing the pass to prevent another surprise attack. Ahead, the gates of the city waited, their stone faces warm in the fading light. Inside the walls, the people gathered to watch the returning fighters. Some offered quiet nods, others stayed silent, their eyes lingering on the human as if still deciding what they thought of him. The woman moved through the crowd with her head high, not glancing at those who whispered. At the base of the main steps, the elder who had spoken the night before waited. His gaze moved between them, and then he gave a slow nod before turning away. Back at the stone building, the air was calm again. The woman leaned her spear against the wall and sat at the low table. The human placed his sword beside it and lowered himself to sit across from her. For a time, they simply looked at one another, the silence carrying more than words could. Then she spoke in her language, her tone softer now, but steady. He caught the word for honor and another for bond. Though he could not understand the rest, he knew what she meant. He answered with the only words he knew in her language, warrior and together. A faint smile touched her lips, and she inclined her head. The distance that had been between them since the arena was gone now, replaced by something built on survival, respect, and the choice to fight side by side. Whatever had begun as a forced bond was now something neither of them would deny. The Weight of the law that had bound them had shifted into something neither elder nor warrior could command. That night, the city was alive with quiet celebration. Torches burned along the streets, and the scent of cooked food drifted through the air. The woman stood at the window, watching the glow of the fires and the slow movement of the people below. The human joined her, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. She did not move away. For the first time since they had met, the moment felt free of expectation. There was only the simple truth that they had faced death together and returned. When the drums began again in the distance, she turned to him with the same steady gaze she had given him in the arena. This time, it held no challenge, only certainty. She spoke once more, the words quiet but clear, and though he did not understand their meaning, he knew they marked the start of something that would outlast the laws of her people and the memory of the battle. In that silence between them, the bond was no longer by custom, it was by choice.